And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America Audio, with your host, Tim Binnall.
Hello out there, my friends. This is Tim Binnall of BinnallofAmerica.com with another edition of BOA Audio Season 3. It is November 24th, 2007. I hope all of our great American listeners had a fantastic Thanksgiving holiday. Let's dive right into the latest dish from BOA Audio, and that is the first half of a marathon conversation with Keith Chester, author of Strange Company, Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II. Strange Company is all about the Foo Fighter era in ufology. The book really brings to light so much information that I had previously never heard of. Many people, I'm sure, hearing this interview will be hearing a lot of new information for the very first time. The Foo Fighter era has almost completely slipped through the cracks of contemporary UFO studies. Many people make the mistake of citing 1947, Kenneth Arnold, Roswell as the beginning, and then they add that sort of footnote that there was this whole Foo Fighter thing during World War II, and then quickly move on. What we're going to do here this week is go on back to that Foo Fighter era and find out so much about what was going on during that time period. We're not going to read through the full list of important points during the interview, but trust me, we are going to run the gamut here, and this is just part one of our interview with Keith Chester. So strap yourselves in for a seriously detailed and deep discussion of the often forgotten Foo Fighter era. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Keith Chester, let me give you a little bit of background on him. Born in 1957, a Sputnik baby, Keith Chester's interest in UFOs began in 1966 with a daylight sighting while growing up in Frederick, Maryland. Art, film, and music have been the constant fuel from which he has drawn inspiration throughout his 50 years. His passionate interest in the UFO phenomenon culminated in the book Strange Company, Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II. At present, he's researching for another book, making abstract films, and tapping into the world around him. Keith doesn't have a website, but you can find Strange Company, Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II all over the web. Go to Amazon.com, go to BarnesandNoble.com. Either one of those places I'm sure will have the book. Or simply go to Anomalous Books. They are the publishers of Strange Company. Without any further ado, let's rock and roll. This interview was recorded on October 10th, 2007. Keith Chester, part 1 of 2, talking about the Foo Fighter era in ufology on Binnall of America Audio, Season 3. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Binnall of America Audio. We have a very special guest with us this week. He is the author of Strange Company, Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II. This is an absolutely fantastic book. I just finished it a couple days ago, right before we do the interview, and I was just amazed by it. It really is an in-depth look at the whole Foo Fighter phenomenon of World War II, and as he notes in the beginning of the book, when you're reading a lot of UFO books, especially ones that cover the history of the UFO phenomenon, they'll maybe give a passing reference to the Foo Fighter era, or maybe spend a couple paragraphs, at most a chapter on it, and it'll be really a cursory chapter on the whole thing. So it's kind of become a forgotten era in UFO history, but it's very, very important, and it really comes before what many people seem to think is the beginning of the UFO era, which is 47 with Kenneth Arnold and Roswell and the atomic bomb and all that great stuff. All of this Foo Fighter stuff happened way before that. It's very, very important to the history of the UFO field, so I cannot commend him enough for a fantastic book, Strange Company, Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II, and we have the author here this week for an in-depth discussion on the Foo Fighter phenomenon. He is Keith Chester. Keith, welcome to the show.
I really appreciate it, Tim. Thanks for inviting me to be on.
Let's start out how we start them all out, I guess, with the bio and the background. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you came from, and how you gravitated towards the UFO subject.
Okay, first of all, I'm a freelance artist, filmmaker, and that's what I do most of the time. However, what started with this project was a sighting I had in the mid-1960s. I was living in Frederick, Maryland, and it was daytime. I was around 11 years old, and I ran outside, and out over the horizon I saw a large circular red ball that was either about 200 to 300 feet away or was far away and very large. And that scared me. I remember getting goosebumps. It was sitting motionless in the sky. It was solid red, so it wasn't being reflected. The sun was behind me down behind the Catoctin Mountains. But it was still around 6 o'clock, summer, and so I ran into a neighbor's house to get my friend to come out and look at it, and that fast it was gone. So that actually started my interest in UFOs. So I had a casual interest. I read a couple books and moved on. And finally, in around 1989, I was with some friends in Frederick, Maryland, and one of the girls told me that an English teacher at her high school had discussed having known about UFOs. And she told her class that in 1969, under the CETA program, which is Civilian Employment Training Agency, she was in college and was able to be placed that summer in the Pentagon in the Office of Civil Defense as a secretary.
Oh, wow.
What was interesting was she was a secretary to a Colonel Sullivan, who was, to her memory, an Army officer. I asked her if he was Air Force, and she said, no, I believe he was Army. And her job was to, it was just her in the office and Colonel Sullivan. Her job was to maintain phone calls, correspondence, whatever he asked her to do. So what took place that one day that really startled her was that Colonel Sullivan was in the office adjoining hers, and 3 officers came in. She believes they were Air Force, and they were discussing what they should do with the UFO craft. When she heard that, she tried her best not to listen, but she couldn't help it. And they discussed having this craft. Now, this is at the Pentagon.
What year was this?
This is 1969.
Okay.
So as far as what year and what craft, I don't know. Maybe it was the Roswell craft. Maybe it was something more current. She didn't know. And she did her best not to listen. But how could you not?
Mm-hmm.
But what really put the fear in her, in the Pentagon, there was a library that was allegedly connected to the Office of Civil Defense or whatever. Well, from what she understood, it was broken into. And the FBI showed up at her home to question her. They questioned her friends. They literally scared the heck out of her. And she knows that the library allegedly was moved to the basement. This is all coming from her employer, the U.S. Army, and Colonel Sullivan. And that just really scared her. And so around 1989, I guess that was about the time Charles Berlitz put out his book, The Roswell Incident. Whatever was taking place in the media, she felt it was okay to talk about UFOs to her class as a subject matter, and they all laughed at her, and she would tell them that story. Well, when I heard that, I said, well, that's fascinating. I need to talk to her. So I took it upon myself to find out what school she was in. But beforehand, I wanted to make sure, since I hadn't conducted any type of interviews or research to this point, I did know enough that I wanted to make sure I didn't lead her.
Yeah.
And so I contacted who I felt was considered one of the best people in the field who was doing crash and retrieval research, was Leonard Stringfield, who has a very long history going back into the 50s with actual research in the field, attached to NICAP and his own organization, his own newsletter. And so I called him up, and much to my surprise, he was more than willing to mentor me in the case. So we laid down some ground rules, what to say, what not to say. And when I approached her, she became very hostile because I just showed up and asked to speak with her after school, and no problem. We went back to a classroom. When I brought the subject up, she became hostile, wanted to know where I found that out. And I tried to tell her, well, this just came from students, and I just have an avid interest. Well, she told the story to me, and that was the end of it, and she told me never to contact her again. So I contacted Mr. Stringfield, and he said, well, she could slap a restraining order on you if you don't be careful. So let's just drop it and see where this goes. And he would try to see what type of information would arise in his files that would correlate with the Office of Civil Defense, which, of course, would be Army.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went on with that, and because I felt that it was an Army situation, the whole Roswell scenario. And so I started investigating. Well, during the course of that, Schmidt and Randall investigation came out with their book, and I decided, when I was talking to Leonard Stringfield, he brought up his World War II sighting, which I found fascinating, and I decided I wanted to contribute something to the field. And from there, I took his story and I just ran with it. And by 1999, I decided, well, I need to, other than reading books and magazines that I could locate, I need to do some research. So I tried to figure out what did exist. And if there was one document that acknowledged the UFO phenomenon, and especially the Foo Fighters, with Stringfield. So I found that document was the Robertson Panel Report, which was the viewers, your listeners may know of as the 1953 CIA-sponsored panel to determine if UFOs were a national security threat, because from 1947 to 52, there was unprecedented amount of sightings throughout the country. And of course, Roswell was in the summer of 1947. However, that was not an issue, or was that ever mentioned until much later. So I found that report, and within the Robertson Panel Report, it talked about the Foo Fighters being an unexplained phenomena. However, they dealt with electromagnetic situations, St. Elmo's fire, whatever it was still classified as phenomenon according to this report. And it said if the term flying saucers existed during World War II, that term would have been applied. That just jumped off the page at me, and at that point I determined, well, there is something definitely significant. What it is, I don't know. I didn't want to read too much between the lines. And I also wanted to try to forget what I had read, forget the literature, and go into it as being totally new, as if I was an intelligence officer with the Army Air Force in World War II as the phenomenon came about.
Yeah.
So in order to do that, I wanted to find out exactly what kind of military and government documentation existed. So I contacted two of the foremost historian researchers in the United States, I still feel this way, Jan Aldridge of Project 1947 and Barry Greenwood. And Barry Greenwood had published a book, I guess in the late 1970s, with the government aspect of what they know and documentation. They have extensive files in their possession of government-related documents. So they gave me and sent me what they had, and surprisingly, it was very, very few military or government documentation that dealt with the subject. Most of it was with one night fighter unit during the war. So a lot of it was also civilian cases or actual cases that were in the press or actual letters written by witnesses during the war, but post-war years. So I wanted to concentrate on the actual military documentation. So in 1999 through 2003, I decided that for me to do anything, I have to do a concentrated research effort. And within 2 hours of my home was the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. So I made weekly trips there, probably 4 to 5 times a month.
Oh, wow.
For that period of time, for those 4 years. And I just dove into all the record groups. I believe if I have this figure right, there's 500 record groups within the archives. Each record group, of course, has millions upon millions of documents. And record groups would be, let's say, the Army Air Force, Office of Scientific Research and Development, Department of State, the Kennedy assassination, Department of Energy, Office of Strategic Services, which was CIA files, huge data bank for anyone who hasn't been there. So I determined to go into the Army Air Force files and any other type of organization that would have been related to the military during the war, which was a great amount, and just dove into the records, found what Barry and Jan had in their possession, and just kept going. And that culminated eventually this past May with my book.
As I said in the introduction, it's amazing. It's a real education for people in the UFO field, I think, because, like as I noted, that there really just isn't much information about the Foo Fighter era. Up until this book came about, why do you think there isn't any there wasn't really any serious investigation into the Foo Fighter era, or at least, it seems to have fallen through the cracks of ufology? Why do you think that is?
Look, a couple things. I think right after the war, it was such a horrible, horrible mental condition that many people put the war behind them. And the actual reports, they didn't exist. Nothing existed. What you had were, as the years progressed after the war, probably in the late 40s, did some of the veterans talk about them. There were articles written during the war about these things, but I believe that by the summer of 47, with the UFO phenomenon, or the flying saucer phenomenon at the time, taking off, it really just overshadowed anything that was prior, because there was so much activity around the United States and the world that most of the researchers concentrated on that. So they did include, some of the more famous authors did include a chapter or mention, but it was strictly what was taking place in the newspapers, what they had accumulated in the newspapers to show there was something before 1947. So we have the Kenneth Arnold on, which just overshadowed everything. That's my opinion of it. So as far as the government military documents, they just didn't exist, or because of FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, more documentation was released into the public domain, but many people didn't have the access or the interest to go into the archives and find them. And so I think it it was time. That's why I dived into it.
Well, it's a huge contribution to the field, I got to say. It's you said you wanted to make a contribution. You definitely did with this book. It's worthy of any serious UFO student's bookshelf for sure.
Well, I appreciate that. I really do. And I just felt it was very necessary. And it was a point where I felt that in 1947, it seemed like there was some type of structure in place within the military and government that I felt that had to be in place beforehand, especially if the UFOs were exactly like they were prior to 1947, which it doesn't make sense why they wouldn't be, because we have, through history, they go back through centuries, allegedly. So I felt there had to be something in place, because the military and governments were working hand in hand, and anything flying in the air during that period of time should have and would have been documented.
So I guess let's just dive right into the Foo Fighter phenomenon. And as we'll explain here in the course of the conversation, Foo Fighter is kind of the catch-all term for all these different phenomena. That's one of the, I guess you could say, misnomers of the Foo Fighter and UFO world, is that Foo Fighter really was just one small aspect of many, many different kinds of phenomena that were going on in the air during the war. So I guess let's just start out with sort of a rundown on some of these phenomena. I have here silver discs, glass balls, balls of fire, something called swarm of bees, Foo Fighters, of course, the list goes on, essentially. So let's, I guess, just talk a little bit about what some of the various different phenomena were.
Okay, well, it actually started right as the war began as lights, and these lights were appearing to the RAF Bomber Command, which they thought were either some type of flare or a combat aircraft with a searchlight in the nose. So again, they attributed that to either the pilots were misidentifying what they were seeing, hallucinations, or indeed some kind of weapon that the Axis powers were utilizing. And there were it really progressed into flares. There were several types of flares being utilized, and they were given them names such as chandelier or scarecrow flares. A scarecrow flare would have been a flare that would actually appear to be at a distance an aircraft going down, a psychological deterrent for the RAF bombers coming into Germany in 42 and on. And as the war progressed, they were getting different names for a lot of these things. So flares, and there were incandescent flares, there were lights. As you said, the disc-shaped objects, or the silver disc, that came into 43. Now, what's interesting about that is when they made their mark on the scene, they had, in September 6th 1943. They were seen over Stuttgart, Germany, and then a month later, October 14th, in Schweinfurt. And these silver discs have been in ufological literature as being geared towards UFO-related aircraft, where, in fact, I believe these were one element that were possibly ordnance-related. And they believed they were full of thermite or some type of explosive device that would bring down an aircraft, drop from a high aircraft onto the bomber formations. And they resembled disc. They resembled glass balls. So some of the pilots in a combat situation seeing this disc go down by them may not realize the distance. It could be a large ship at a distance, or it could be something very close. So there was confusion. However, they had captured some of these, not captured, but recovered some of these, and one aircraft actually went down. They believe that one of these devices hit the wing. But it was still a nebulous subject. Air intelligence memoranda was confused by it, but there were many theories offered. And what I think was happening was there were ordnance devices in the air, but they were also being confused by maybe possible aircraft. And this is where it's just a shady ground.
Yeah.
And the swarms of bees you talk about, the bomber crews would see what they thought were, they also called them confetti flak. And what they believed they were ordnance shells full of material to screw the radar up, or actually get into the propellers of the aircraft to conk the engine out to bring it down. And they would be a swarm, like a swarm of confetti floating around in the air that the bombers would go by. So that was another ordnance radar-related type of thing that, depending on the distance, could be misidentified. And here again, the reason I'm saying this misidentification is because terminology has started becoming a very, very large problem with the confusion surrounding the phenomenon, the subject. And of course, throughout the memoranda, starting in 42, anytime the things were seen, they were still being labeled as phenomena or phenomenon within the military intelligence reports. The balls of fire were a term given by the Air Ministry, Royal Air Force bomber crews. And at first, they appeared to be some type of rocket or maybe a flare, but it was also a catch-all term because they were a bright light. They looked like they were on fire at nighttime to a lot of the British bombers because they were conducting nighttime raids. And then, of course, all these terms are all the way through the war, even like we discussed with the silver disc. Even though most of the intelligence memoranda had determined that this was possible ordnance related, even in 45, the Army Air Force Commander-in-Chief, General Arnold, was still getting reports with descriptions of what this stuff might be. So they weren't really sure if everything was related. And then, of course, the Foo Fighters, which everyone knows, did not really come on the scene until November of 1944. And that term was named by one unit, the 415th Night Fighter Squadron. The men of that unit some of them were really into the Smokey Stover cartoons of the 1940s. And Smokey Stover was a firefighter, madcap firefighter, and his vehicle was called the Foo Mobile, F-O-O Mobile. And so they just started naming them that. And of course, that term caught on through the rest of the war, but it was really only for a 3 or 4 month period where that term hit the intelligence memoranda, but it was that term that made it to the major press.
Yeah.
And that's how everyone around the world started understanding there was something strange being seen.
One of the things I was wondering is, in the book, there's only a couple pictures of purported Foo Fighters, but I was always under the impression that there was a fair amount of, filming technology on these planes for the gun cameras or whatever. Why is there such a lack of photographs of the Foo Fighters? Is it something that may have been confiscated by higher-ups when the planes returned, or is it just that they couldn't take pictures in time, or what's the scenario with that?
Well, it's my impression that there was much air photographic intelligence kept on the subject and much film still photographs everything, but nothing's been found. And that means two things to me. One, either it wasn't, my information is wrong, and the pilots and the air crews who said, yeah, we got film of this thing. I know there was film. It was taken to higher headquarters. I don't know what happened to it after that. It really wasn't their concern. So one, if it was, let's say it was ordnance related, well, of course they would be taking pictures, but why doesn't it exist at this day and time? Meaning that it was either so outlandish or so unique that to this day it is related to UFO phenomenon, or it doesn't exist. Why? I believe that the photographic information does exist, and for some reason it's being kept, let's say, in the Pentagon or whatever archive for the military and government is keeping it. So the question is, what does it represent and why? So to me, if it is still being classified, there's something significant to it, and that's why the intelligence memoranda still said phenomenon all through the war. So why it's not out, and it's just another thing. Why so much documentation is missing? That is the mystery. And that is the key to why we're trying to research this whole topic.
Yeah, and you kind of touch on the problem of the nomenclature, I guess you could say, of the time, where each sort of sighting was kind of like a snowflake in a way, and each person sort of had their own way of describing it, and as these reports kept coming in, they may have seen the same phenomenon, but they might have called it by different names. One might come back and in the report will say flares, and the other one will come back and it'll say, balls of fire. And obviously that was a big problem for the people investigating it.
Yes.
From what you've researched and from all the reports that you've looked at, and the book is just jam-packed with great reports on these sightings, is there any, I guess you could say, like, classification of the different phenomena that was in the sky at the time?
Yes, they started, Bomber Command, the British Bomber Command started classifying early on, and they had their flares, they had their balls of fire, they had, like, meteor-type rockets. They were seeing things that they assumed were rockets, but it was challenging their intelligence because, allegedly, the Germans didn't have these sophisticated rockets at this time. But they had to look at it as it was German secret technology. So they had to start early and start this classification to weed out sightings that had similar names but meant the same thing.
Yeah.
But it became very confusing, and even the War Department, I came across a file in the War Department General Staff, Special Staff files, where they actually had a spec binder that they gave, I'd say, different numbers to identify different type of sightings. So they, too, the Army Air Force, of course, didn't start till 1942 actively in operations in Europe. So once they got on board, they were like starting to see these things, too. So they, too, had to jump on and do the classifications. And even the classifications, they have to be looked at and understood that they too are not accurate because, of course, it had to do with the air crews coming down, discussing their sighting with the air intelligence personnel. And, of course, that whole issue is confusing, too, because there were no consistent ways that the air intelligence personnel were handling the cases. In some cases, they laughed at the pilots, they ridiculed them, they made fun of them. They thought they were drinking. Other cases, the sightings were so incredible, yet the intelligence officers totally blew it off like it was seeing a normal German aircraft.
Yeah.
So that's the mystery in itself, too.
What are the different types of things that we know for sure?
They would have been listed as flare-related, jet-related, rocket-related, and then, of course, experimental weaponry.
Yeah.
They tried to get them down into that. And there were so many crossovers, they were just meshing with each other because they couldn't get accurate reports from the air crews because, well, for one, the air crews were scared to death most of the time. So their observational skills were more on their targets or the attacking aircraft.
Yeah.
It was only in the cases where these guys were coming back from missions where they were alone in the sky, where they were over what they assumed was friendly territory, that some of the sightings were able to be given in more detail.
Now let's talk a little bit about how the the governments, the armies really, the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Air Force started investigating these things. Because as the pilots were coming in and telling these stories, then obviously there had to be an investigation because they weren't sure what these things were, whether they were, it seemed like they presumed they were German technology. So obviously they were going to investigate that because they needed to be ahead of the game, if you will, during the wars. So let's talk a little bit about how the investigation came about and sort of how that evolved. And obviously it started with the Royal Air Force, then the U.S. Air Force came in when they joined the war.
Okay, well, I guess the first report to come out of the Royal Air Force would then have been August 11th, 1940, and that title of that report was Phenomena Connected with Enemy Night Tactics. And that was what they saw, lights. And they were in situations where they assumed it was enemy aircraft. The question was, why would an enemy aircraft during a combat situation be flying around with its lights on the whole time? Especially if it wasn't attacking or being attacked. They could never get to it. So there was a mystery there. And the way they started handling this was, of course, it had to be German. That's what we're dealing with. But on another situation behind the scenes, we had the information being funneled to the RAF, from the RAF to the Air Ministry. And of course, the Air Ministry had a scientific intelligence division. And heading that was Dr. R.V. Jones, who many know was very involved with all the air intelligence matters for the Air Ministry during World War II. Now, he personally believed there was nothing to the Foo Fighters. There was nothing to UFOs, nothing at all. However, when he first came on the scene, he was reviewing case files of all types of things, alleged reports of electromagnetic weaponry, death rays, biological warfare, all types of crazy things that were coming in from all over Europe from intelligence operatives on the ground. So for him to get reports of an unusual craft, it would have been very important for him to do so. And unfortunately, these files have not been found. But he had to be collecting this information, for one, just out of national defense. And early in the book, we know there were in the 1930s, Scandinavia was being inundated. Finland, Norway, Sweden were seeing lights in the sky. Some were pretty dramatic, some were just simply lights, some appeared to be aircraft. However, the press of the day and the investigations conducted by Sweden and Norway determined that the aircraft were conducting maneuvers and operations that were far in advance of Russia or Germany or any of the suspected countries that would be gearing up for war, because this was in 1933. So we know that Germany didn't invade Poland until 1939. And if they were conducting these types of extensive air operations, even over out of the coast of the eastern United States, lights were being seen. The press is wanting to know, these pilots are operating in storms. They're flying in severe weather in areas that require fueling. Where are the bases? Where are they landing? Why are they operating over such treacherous territory with no apparent place to land when we're dealing with biplanes of the time? So I believe the investigations were in place for very unconventional aircraft starting in the 30s. When the war broke out, those investigations were still there, but conducted within the Air Ministry, and then when the United States became involved through what's called the London mission, where we actually set up office in London, exchanged information. That is where we became very involved with the phenomenon. That is, of course, if we weren't already, because we know in February 1942 in the United States, the alleged so-called Battle of Los Angeles occurred on the West Coast. Again, triangle formations, lights in the sky, unaffected by anti-aircraft fire, and of course General Marshall fires off to the President a memo determining that craft were seen, unknowns, that were fired upon, and to this date that remains a mystery. So the United States and Britain, early war, were most likely involved with unconventional aircraft investigations. And my thought is they were not thinking extraterrestrial or something like that. It was definitely Axis powers and threat. So, but as the information came in, the sightings were more remarkable. They just remained in the background, and we don't see any real official military investigation until 1943, when the RAF started investigating alleged rocket reports. These rockets are coming up or appearing out of nowhere. They're outmaneuvering the fighter aircraft. They can keep up with them. They go along with them. They disappear. And their intelligence told them Germany had not set up programs like that, and they weren't aware of any type of rocket that could actually perform that and keep that kind of thrust. You know, some of the sightings would last for minutes on end, and there would never be a distinguished light or anything, and these things would just maneuver. And so the investigations were in place, but they were being, of course, now overshadowed by military sightings too. So by the time that happened, and then of course when the Foo Fighters came on the scene, that was a very, very important aspect to the United States, because in January, SHAEF was formed in Europe, and that would be the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force under General Eisenhower. Well, in SHAEF, they had a scientific advisory section, and that was headed by Dr. H.P. Robertson, who, in 1953, was in charge of the Robertson panel that conducted the UFO research, or conducted the investigation of the UFOs sighted from 47 to 52, and if they affected national security. So we see a relationship there. So by then, Robertson had been in Europe with the London mission since 41. He was most likely aware of all the unusual sightings because he was friends with Dr. R.V. Jones of the Air Ministry. And then by the time SHAEF was formed, there he was. And we know for a fact, and I was the first to find the actual documentation to show he was put in place, he was asked to conduct the investigation, or at least oversee it, of the Foo Fighters, because that was the term they were using, of course, in the press. So I don't know how much was being censored, and that's another problem. They were using the term Foo Fighter because that's what the public knew. Just in case the press got a hold of the documentation or it was leaked, they could say, oh, it's just the Foo Fighters. We don't know what this stuff was. We've never been involved with it. But I tend to believe that they were totally investigating the unconventional aircraft all the way up until January when Robertson took over. However, I don't have the documentation to prove that.
Mm-hmm. And that's really important to point out, in the sense that Robertson is really well known in the UFO world for, of course, the Robertson panel. And what I didn't know until I read the book here was that he had been sort of involved in investigating the UFOs for way longer than when the Robertson panel came out. So he had a pretty serious amount of investigation done into the whole thing. Probably, would you say, a decade at least prior to the Robertson panel?
Yes, and if he wasn't doing the investigations himself, he was overseeing the investigative apparatus that was.
Yeah. And
he knew the people who were. That's the key point. So he was well informed, no doubt. Yeah,
he was getting tons of information. Talk about one of the key players in the book who is really in there throughout the book, and that's David Griggs. I guess talk about his role in the whole Foo Fighter investigation and in throughout the war and all that good stuff.
Okay. I'd say Dr. David T. Griggs was one of the most important people involved with the phenomenon, because he was, at the time, in 1942, he was actually the radar expert or scientific consultant to Dr. Edward Bowles. Dr. Edward Bowles was a scientific advisor to the Secretary of War, Robert Patterson. So Dr. Griggs had an office. His office was in Dr. Edward Bowles' office. And as a radar expert, Dr. Griggs was helping the United States Army Air Force with their radar and radar-related apparatuses. And he was very instrumental in making sure that the equipment was up to par, that was malfunctioning, how they could improve upon it. And that was very important. And the aspect of radar is very important because of course, the unconventional aircraft, flying saucer, UFO, whatever, were being detected and not detected on radar. So this in itself brought him to full focus on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
He and Robertson worked together on the Advisory Specialist Group for the United States Tactical Air Forces. He was also involved with General Keeney's Far East Air Force in the Pacific, and he also was asked to conduct the Foo Fighter investigation by General Arnold, who was the Army Air Force Commander-in-Chief. He was affiliated with the ALSOS mission, which was the most important mission of the war, and that was headed by Dr. Samuel Goudsmit. What's significant about that is the ALSOS mission was the United States' attempt to learn what the Axis powers had regarding the atomic bomb. They had reason to believe that they were very close to having the bomb, if not already having it. That operation was sent into Italy, and they had to determine what was known, but they really couldn't find answers till they got into Germany. So that mission in itself was very, very important. Dr. Griggs was friends with the scientific chief of that mission, Dr. Samuel Goudsmit. Another important aspect of that is Dr. Samuel Goudsmit was part of the Robertson panel. So we have two key players on the Robertson panel who were very well informed of the World War II situation and the Foo Fighters.
Mm-hmm.
Griggs was undoubtedly probably the most important player because, from my information, he was one of the only civilian scientists, or the only civilian in the European theater of operations who had a license to fly. So he could go to any Air Force base or any Air Force aerodrome or airfield and grab a plane, and he had complete authority to do so and fly to his location. And he did so at one point when they were discovering some of the laboratories in Germany that had to do with atomic research. What's important about the atomic research is, let's say there were atomic bombs in Germany, and we don't think there were, but there's still controversy that they were very close. There's information that shows they were extremely close in doing this. So close that General Eisenhower, one of the things that he didn't tell his men going in on D-Day was that going in with those waves were men who had Geiger counters, who were checking radiation because they were scared to death that they were going to be using low-grade atomic particles in the V1s and hit the beaches and just devastate the guys. They were scared. Fortunately, that occurred on June 6th, and the V1s flew on June 12th, but they went in towards London and Antwerp. They didn't go into the beaches, so it didn't happen. But he was scared. That was actually one of his worries, that they were going to be radiated on the beaches. So they knew things were in the works. So the ALSOS mission related to the flying saucer story is, if there were capabilities in Germany at the time to deliver an atomic bomb somewhere, and that we know that they had planned to bomb New York. There were definite plans. They had the Empire State Building targeted as ground zero. If aircraft of unconventional means that surpassed anything that we could get up to meet it could take this bomb over, it was important. So therefore, the unconventional aircraft, Dr. Griggs, Dr. Robertson, had to be on top of all this intelligence coming in. And that's why another reason the Army Air Forces were definitely wanting to keep an investigation going. So they would probably label it as experimental aircraft for public domain. However, I think there may have been reason to think there was something else due to some of the extraordinary sightings seen in the war that was totally baffling to them and were beyond the technological capabilities known at the time.
Now, Griggs, he issued a report towards the end of the war on his investigation into the Foo Fighters, but you said that it can't be found. No one knows where it is.
Right.
What's the story with that whole thing?
Well, in Dr. Griggs, it was 1969. He was in California at a college. I forget what college off the top of my head. But Dr. James McDonald, who, as many know, is a great force in the hunt for the answer to the UFO phenomenon, was working as a professor at the University of Arizona. And he, of course, in his first few years had come across these Foo Fighter reports. And he was trying to put together what it was. So, of course, Dr. Griggs came up, and he contacted Dr. Griggs in 1969 and conducted two telephone interviews with him. Griggs told McDonald that he indeed was asked by General Arnold to look into the Foo Fighters. This is the European Foo Fighters. And then he was also asked to look into the balls of fire, which were the Pacific sightings, which were a little different than what the European were. He felt that the European sightings were rare, they were different, and however there were sightings in the Pacific that mimicked that type of sighting, but they were also among another whole situation where there were a lot of ordnance and aircraft weaponry that was being experienced for the first time that the pilots had to get used to, such as the Baka, which was pretty much a rocket sled, put a guy in it and just ram. So it was a suicidal rocket, basically. And so they had to deal with that. But Griggs was interviewed by McDonald. The reports were written. He said so. They were passed on, but he doesn't have a copy. And where they went, that's the mystery, because they're definitely not in the Army Air Force files. To date, they have not been found in General Arnold's files, and to date, they have not been mentioned anywhere else. So whatever is housing the phenomenon reports and this whole investigative aspect of the situation during the war, these reports sit. I suspect it really is at the Pentagon, where civilians aren't going to get their hands on it.
Yeah. Just to sort of talk a little bit about the way you investigated this whole thing. Now, let's say you wanted to find that Griggs thing. Do you have to go to the National Archive and look and stuff, or can you put in a request? Or if you put in a request for the David Griggs, you're probably going to get tons of stuff. Is there any way to really find that sort of thing, or is it just sort of you're going to have to get lucky?
I believe it comes down to luck. I really think the FOIA, which is an excellent tool, we've used FOIA for Dr. Griggs, but no results. And when it comes down to researching the archives, there is that chance, and that's what kept me going. I mean, I would go for months and find nothing, because what I had to do was look through all these military and civilian scientific organization records and learn what that was about. So there was never talk of anything related to the phenomenon, usually. So I'm learning how this worked, and for instance, I'd be looking for a report that I knew there was let's say a Foo Fighter sighting. Well, it wouldn't be where I thought it was. It wouldn't be in the record group, the Army Air Force group. But lo and behold, I'd stumbled upon that report in another record group, which would be like the War Department record group. So one element of armed service would destroy the records. They were destroying the records, or it's still classified, or the copy was misplaced. They did that, and they had a war decimal file. Some of the decimal files would represent certain categories, like 319.1 is a decimal file number, which meant reports. 000.9 is a decimal file number that meant natural and unnatural phenomena. Now, a lot of UFO post-World War II, like 1947 and on, were under 000.9. Some of those were found in that decimal file. So it could be anywhere, and if you look at some of the reports where they were generated to the other agencies, it's astounding. Some reports went to 13, 14, 30 agencies all over the place. So someone has it. It's just who got rid of it, who reclassified it, and that's the grab bag aspect of searching the archives, because you don't know where the files are going to be located. And most of the time, you can assume it has been censored or it has been gone through and taken out for some reason.
Yeah. All right. Now, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but I think it's important to discuss, and that's sort of this disconnect between the pilots, the intelligence people on the base, and the higher-ups who wanted the reports. And the intelligence people seem more often than not to ridicule the pilots when they came back, or, as you said, accuse them of drinking, or all sorts of foolishness. And it's sort of a strange scenario here, because the guys on the bottom of the rung, the pilots, they were interested in what happened, and the people at the top were interested, but the people in the middle sort of, they kind of poo-pooed the whole thing. Talk a little bit about that culture, I guess you could say, that was going on at the time?
Okay, well, first of all, at the squadron level, when the men were coming in from their missions, you can imagine the horror. They were dealing with people, their friends dying. They were dealing with a lot of horrific sights. They were scared to death. They were in close combat with other aircraft. So they were coming in and in a lot of cases talking to their buddies who happened to be S2s or A2s, which were squadron-level intelligence people, to take the report, interrogate them, calm them down, try to extract as much information as possible so they could collect, correlate all the reports and put some type of picture together. So at the squadron level, you think, okay, what's going on here? In a lot of cases, the intelligence officers just didn't believe it. When they heard these wild stories and these incredible stories, one thought, well, the guy was scared. He misidentified something. He saw something that just wasn't there out of fear. He hallucinated. And so you have that, but at the same time, you'll have scenarios where the S2 officers, for some reason, at the squadron level, would act as if it was nothing. They were hearing something. Some of these men would give them stories that came out of the annals of science fiction, yet they were like, that's fine, took the report, but act nothing, no questioning, nothing at all. So you suspect that, well, were these intelligence officers at the squadron level informed by the different commands to handle the reports differently? So we have an array of reporting systems. We could look at it in several ways. One, let's say it's Bomber Command, and they have their unit intelligence officer interrogating the people. And the unit intelligence officer starts to ridicule the bomb crews. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is the bomb crew people are going to resent it. They're going to be fearful of being grounded because they didn't want to have to go for psychological analysis. And so they're going to shut up. Well, the higher commands realized, well, they shut up. We're not going to get the intelligence data we need. So don't ridicule them. But then you'd have other commands who may have said, look, we know what's taking place. Take the report. Keep quiet. Don't say anything. Don't offer any information. Take it. Get it to us immediately. Of course, that's speculation on my part. But when you look at the reports and you look at throughout the war how this was being handled, then you say, well, why is there no set standard for taking these reports? And, of course, I think we're just dealing with human factors here. The great example of that was during a 1942 sighting, and where I have a quote from this would be number 5 group to Bomber Command relating to a pretty incredible sighting. And December 3rd, 1942, and it says here, this went to the Bomber Command. Herewith a copy of a report received from a crew of the Lancaster after raid on Turin. The crew refuses to be shaken in their story in the face of the usual banter. And that's official documentation. So that shows that for some reason the RAF crews were being harassed and ridiculed. Some people thought they were drinking. So it just, to answer your question, that's a mystery that I need to further explore, because since there's so little documentation, it shows that I have to assume a scenario and then investigate it in that light to see what comes forth.
Yeah.
But right now, it's just, you pick the unit, you might find different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Nowadays, when the military type folks see UFO and they tell their boss or whatever, oftentimes it comes back where they're like, they take the information and they're like, shut up about this, don't tell anybody. It doesn't seem like that was really the case during World War II. Did that happen very often, or did it develop over time during World War II, or was it just like you said, dependent on what different branch you were at?
Yes, there were cases. I can, off the top of my head, I think I can think of 2. One case was where the unit actually named the Foo Fighters, the 415th. Harold Augsburger, Major Harold Augsburger, was the unit commander for the 415th station in France of the night fighter unit. And at one point, he was told and heard through his operations officer to drop the subject. It was a classified situation. So there in itself, that was pretty much don't pursue it.
Yeah.
As far as the pilots and crews themselves, no. I've heard stories but I'm not sure how accurate those stories are. But generally, no, there was nothing that, don't talk about this. They really wanted the intelligence to come in because, the primary situation was there was a war going on, a heavy-duty situation with Germany being very advanced, and they knew they were going to be encountering some pretty incredible things, such as jets and rocket-propelled aircraft.
Yeah. All right. Now, I cherry-picked some of the key cases I thought stood out, and we'll just sort of hit on these, and feel free to add as much detail as you want. Let's really dig into some of these key cases. And I guess the first one, and I just went by the names that are affiliated, I guess you could say, with the cases. So you'll know which ones I'm talking about, I'm sure. And the first one is the Savinsky case, which is really the first big one, it seems, where there was shooting at the objects and all sorts of crazy stuff happened. So why don't you talk about the Savinsky sighting or case first, and we'll talk about that.
Okay, to me that is probably the key to this date, early war sighting. Now, the problem is there's no official documentation. However, we have Savinsky on tape relating his story. And I, for one, am not going to call someone a liar or disbelieve them. And hearing his testimony on the whole encounter is just something remarkable happened. And it took place on June 25th, 1942. And Captain Savinsky was a Wellington bomber pilot. He was with a Polish division attached to the RAF. And he had been going into Germany over the Ruhr Valley because that was the industrialization area of Germany on a bombing mission. Coming back, he was out over Holland heading into, I believe, the North Sea. And coming up on the rear of the aircraft with a round, shiny object. It was copper-colored, solid. It looked as if it was like a setting sun color all the way through. And it was the size of a full moon. So this object came up on the aircraft, and of course Savinsky said, well, this is something, a rocket, whatever it is coming after us, is going to attack. So he let it get fairly close to the aircraft, I believe several hundred yards, 200 yards or so, and told his men to open up. And so two of his gunners opened up simultaneously on this object, and the remarkable thing that they witnessed was that their tracer rounds were entering the object. They were sure of this because of the two guns meeting at one point, and they weren't exiting. They weren't going through it. They weren't bouncing off this. They were just disappearing into this object. So that startled them, of course. After a while, the circular object jumped from one wing over the aircraft to the other with remarkable maneuvering capabilities. And they fired into it again, and it shot off. It took off, and so they were pretty startled. When they got on the ground, they reported it, and the first thing out of the intelligence officer's mouth was, "You were drinking." So they shut up because Savinsky knew not to push an issue like that. And so Savinsky decided to do some of his own investigation, and he asked one of the bomber crews who had come in a few minutes after he did, and indeed, that crew too saw the object, encountered this particular object, and they chose not to report it. But Savinsky and his crew did, so that report disappeared into the black hole of great documentation that should exist. So that, to me, was one of the key early war to show that, okay, if this was June 25th, 1945, okay, possible experimental aircraft, who knows what, but you can at least give it some type of, okay, there's more that it might be. They just misidentified. But this early in the war, I don't see how Germany had any type of rocket capability, even though they had rockets that could do and perform in that manner. So that, to me, was a very key case to start off the whole book.
And I guess before I go to the next one, as the war went on, these strange sightings became sort of like people knew about them, I guess you could say, the pilots and stuff, and, it wasn't a big surprise to other pilots, I guess, when it happened to, their friends or whatever. But when the Savinsky case happened, how prevalent were these strange sightings? Was this really out of the ordinary, or was it sort of like, the guy came back and he was like, hey, I saw it too, type of thing?
To my knowledge, it was pretty out of the ordinary. That, of course, is just limited to my knowledge of the subject. How many veterans went to their grave or still are holding on to this information from that period. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like I said, the ridicule that they were receiving in the early war generally was, they didn't like the repercussions of that. They didn't like to be looked at. They were on an honorable mission to conduct combat against the enemy, and the last thing they wanted to do was report something that was really out of science fiction magazines in terms of anything else that the Allied air forces were aware of or knew of, or how could something, how could you possibly shoot at something with two machine guns and it doesn't affect it and it sucks it up like a black hole?
Yeah.
You didn't see that correctly. That was not something you saw. It was farther away than you realized. There's no way a rocket could jump over from one side of your aircraft at an extraordinary speed. There must have been two. So you can see how that would have happened and why that would really have scared a lot of the crews from reporting the greater sightings.
Yeah. And then the next case you kind of touched on already, but I guess we'll delve into it a little more, and that's the Stuttgart-Schweinfurt series, I guess you could say, of cases. And it's the only case where a plane goes down via whatever the unknown anomaly is, and that seems to suggest it probably was some kind of flak or, defense, I guess you could say, by the Germans. And it also sort of highlights the key problem with the Foo Fighter phenomenon in that trying to figure out what's coming from the Germans and what's coming from, beyond Earth is really tough to do. And the Stuttgart-Schweinfurt case really sort of exemplifies all that in one. So I guess talk a little bit about that and the downed plane and why you think that was probably ordnance and not something extraterrestrial or maybe a mix of both.
Well, if we can look at it several ways. For one, that series of events, we know that in the Mediterranean theater of operations, and then, of course, European, these so-called ordnance-related discs were being observed in the memoranda. So we're following, if we look at the picture here now through the eyes of the intelligence memoranda, they were saying it was ordnance, and they were putting the theories of what it might be, because apparently they had recovered one of the objects, but that hasn't been proven yet. But the intelligence memoranda reflects that the ordnance aspect of this. And of course, you have these pilots who were seeing the objects fall from above. They were falling in a downward pattern, so that in itself seems like an aerial bombing. Something high up released it. However, they never could determine where the source was. They never could find the German high-altitude bomber or whatever to drop these things. Yet, in the state of combat, I could see how a high-altitude aircraft may not be seen. Mm-hmm. Especially when you're not looking for it and it's been dropped and the thing's has moved on, the aircraft itself. So there were several, what they saw, glass balls, a silver disc, and there were things called rods that were, it was an aerial ordnance. They were trying to come up with any way they could to screw up the bomber formations because they were just raising hell with the industry in Germany. Mm-hmm. So it all made sense. But what doesn't make sense is you will get other reports, not in the intelligence memoranda, that said that they saw these discs or these silver balls or these glass balls or whatever they were that were huge. So, there are some cases where they were very large. They maneuvered in towards the aircraft and moved out. So here again, I think we have a situation where several types of phenomena were being seen, ordnance and possible unconventional aircraft or flying saucer, whatever. And that is the problem. But the significance of the two bombing raids, the Stuttgart and the Schweinfurt of 1943, is that the term flying disc or disc shape was now in the memoranda. And because of that, you have a pilot reporting something, I saw one, a silver disc. Well, they just assume, the ordnance. Well, that guy could have seen a silver disc hovering out in the distance, and it was actually an aircraft, but they just threw it in there.
Yeah.
And this is where the controversy arises. But I would say most UFO researchers today consider the Schweinfurt and the Stuttgart the ordnance-related aspect. However, we have to be careful and not discount some of the reports due to the fact that they may have been seeing something very unusual. In addition to
the one plane that went down because one of the things, the phenomenon or whatever it was, fell on the wing of the plane and the plane went down. They lost a guy. You think that's ordnance related?
Yes, that it seems to be absolutely. And of course, the report that came out of it gave a very brief description, so I never did find the report of the downed aircraft or who that was. Or that remains to be discovered, and it seems to me that just to look at it through the eyes of ordnance, okay, if something's falling out of the sky to disrupt your engines, such as we know with the confetti flak, they thought that that's what they were going to try to do, suck it into the engine, shut it down, or just dropping debris out of the sky just to hit these aircraft will, one aircraft gets hit, he falters and crashes into another and just raise havoc. These were situations, but I don't have any reports from the German side. I don't have that, we did indeed drop these discs. We don't have that. Or if it exists, I haven't discovered yet, or I'm not aware of it.
Yeah.
That's again, it's the mystery.
Part of the reason why it probably stands to reason that it's ordnance is that in the whole vast collection of reports here in Strange Company, there's no real reports of hostility by the Foo Fighters or aerial phenomena or, what we would term as UFOs. So it seems like that they were non-hostile, so it wouldn't make much sense for them to down a craft.
Exactly. If it was an aircraft or a drone, it means it's a suicidal type of thing. But if you go to the Pacific, they had crazy things they were seeing, such as they called them in the memoranda fire extinguishers, balls and chains, egg crates, and these things. There were just different objects just to raise havoc. Actually, two balls with a chain, so that chain would wrap around the propeller and stop it working. So they actually saw that. So if you look at the Pacific War, what the Japanese were doing, and go back to Stuttgart and Schweinfurt, you say, an attempt to knock those planes down.
Yeah.
And they were, Germany was just having a hell of a time with that, trying to keep that at bay, because they were, they couldn't afford to lose industry, so they had to go underground. What happened at the end of the war because of that.
And the next key case I wanted to mention and point out was the Leet case. And as you say in the book, that's the first case of which that mentions heat coming from the object. The pilot saw an object and he experienced some intense heat. Talk a little bit about the Leet case and how important that one is.
Okay, so we're moving on to 1944, and that's November 24th, which is a good date because this was over Italy, Trieste, Italy, I believe it's called, and it was Captain William Leet with the U.S. 15th Air Force. Captain Leet and his crew were on a lone wolf mission to bomb a target in Salzburg. A lone wolf mission meaning one aircraft, run at night, hit your target, and run. Just a harassing situation. Just give it up. And it also gave the pilots an ability to accumulate another mission to get them out of there. After 25 missions, they were gone. No more flights. And that was if we can make it, but it was very rare that you could hit that. So they were on their way home and coming off one of the wingtips with a perfect circle, yellow in color, and they ran over the Adriatic Sea. And for 50 minutes, this circular object was about 10 feet in diameter, what they thought, paced their aircraft. And at one point before it disappeared, as it zoomed away, one of the crew members, I believe a ball gunner, I'm not sure, felt the heat of the object. And so it was disappeared in the distance like a light switched off. And that is the first time there's actual physical reports of an encounter. But unfortunately, the report does not exist. But what is key with this case is William Leet became a huge proponent in MUFON. He was I think, a state director or assistant state director. He became very good friends with Richard Hall. And before his death, up to that time, he was a big proponent that we were dealing with extraterrestrial aircraft.
Yeah.
And of course, he had reported that to his intelligence officer, who, by the way, did not ridicule him, but treated in shock, like he could not believe it, because they knew for a fact there were no searchlights, which were a real problem, and there were no anti-aircraft defenses of any real means in that area. So for him to encounter something like that, it really shook, according to Leet, the intelligence officer who he told it to.
Wow. And then the last case I have here that I've written down for key cases, and then we'll get into some other ones that you think are important. The last one here I have on the list is the Len Stringfield case. A lot of people probably don't know that ufological legend Len Stringfield, they probably maybe know that he was a pilot in World War II, but maybe they don't know that he had a Foo Fighter sighting. So, and there were some significant elements to his sighting. Let's talk about Len Stringfield's sighting and what those significant elements were.
Okay, well, what's significant about Len Stringfield's sighting was that it was August 28, 1945. The war was over. both the European and Japanese theater of operations. And so the Allied air forces had complete air superiority. So the key thing about Stringfield's sighting is he was with the intelligence capacity with the 5th Air Force. And Len was some of the first men to fly into the Isugi Aerodrome in Japan to prep it for the invasion of Japan in November. So he was, after the bombing of Nagasaki, he was with the first group of air intelligence to go into the air base, set it up, and everything else. He was flying out over open ocean between the islands of Iyashima and Iojima in a C-46 aircraft, and he was looking out the window, and out from a cloud bank during broad daylight were 3 teardrop-shaped, what he assumed were intelligently controlled aircraft that looked like glowing magnesium come out of the cloud bank and approach the aircraft at a distance, he said, of holding a lot of the World War II veterans say this, holding a dime up at arm's length.
Yeah, I noticed that in the book.
So it was interesting he said that, but that's what he saw. No problem. Very mystified by the subject, the sighting. However, about that time, the aircraft started experiencing mechanical malfunction. He heard a lot of commotion in the cockpit, didn't understand what. The co-pilot came back and said, prepare to ditch the aircraft, prepare for a ditching, which scared the hell out of him, according to his story. He said that he then noticed that about that time, it was only, I guess, a few moments that those 3 aircraft went back into a cloud bank, and his aircraft then regained control. Well, they made an emergency stop at Iojima, and he got out of the aircraft and noticed that the left wing had leaked oil all the way down the side of the aircraft. So he wanted to try to interview, or at least ask the pilots what was going on, but they had been whisked away for debriefing. And he had things he had to do according to his assignments, and was not able to do that. Then he made his way back to, of course, the Isugi Aerodrome. He never did find the pilots. He never did find out what happened to the report, if any. But it was a very significant report because we now have an engine malfunction which seems to be associated with those aircraft.
Yeah.
To that day, till the day he died, this is according to Richard Hall, because Lynn never told me this, that he would never fly again. When he got out of the service in November 1945, he never flew in another aircraft because of that event.
Wow.
He just took mass transportation. And then, of course, as we all know, or people new to listening, he devoted pretty much the rest of his life to UFO research.
And what are some of the other key cases you think bear mention here from the book and from this period and era in ufology and in the Foo Fighter era?
I'd say some of the key cases early would be August 5th, 1942, which was a sighting by a witness on the USS Helm destroyer off the Solomon Islands, and this was in preparation for the first of the island hopping campaigns. Those islands included Guadalcanal, so you can imagine the severity of what was going to be happening to the Marines coming ashore. The fleet sat offshore. This is August 5th. I believe the actual island campaign started on the 7th. And coming in on the fleet was a silver-colored, and this is the first time that a cigar-shaped object had been reported. Towards the fleet completely opened up. The object was within range and circled the fleet, and no hits. But what's incredible about this is not only the first silver cigar-shaped object was that, according to personnel on the USS Helm, it was clocked at over 10,000 miles per hour.
Wow.
Departing. So, once again, this was reported by the ship's captain because they couldn't break radio silence at that stage of the game. So he assured the crew, according to this witness, that he would contact air intelligence to determine what they encountered. And word came back, and according to his captain, it was not Japanese or German. And that's the last he heard of it. And of course, this report came after the war by the witness. So we are missing that type of documentation. However, it's significant in that it started the silver-colored cigar-shaped objects that we saw later in the 50s and 60s appear on the scene. Another key case was over Turin, Italy, in November of 1942. RAF squadron, Captain Lever, was on a mission and looked out about 200 to 300 feet in length with an object traveling what he thought to be around 500 miles per hour. And it had 4 red lights that were equally spaced along its body. That in itself startled him because it had the appearance of no aircraft with wings. Now, was that a Zeppelin, and was it a balloon? Well, there was no reason for those two type of balloons or a Zeppelin to be in a vicinity of a combat zone. 2, the actual craft was seen earlier by another crew over Amsterdam that had been on the ground, came up and was traveling along the Alps. But this, it was able to travel at 500 miles per hour. It was maneuvering, and it was wingless. So it was actually just right there. So that is the case where they investigated that Bomber Command received that the crew refused to be shaken in the story of the usual banter. So that's pretty significant because that's our first official documentation that something very strange was seen. Air intelligence didn't believe it. So to cover air intelligence, but they had to state that, we gave them hell. We told them they were seeing things, they misidentified, and the crew would not change the story. So that's very significant. I guess the key sighting of 1943, which there weren't a whole lot that I have that were very significant. However, over the Ruhr Valley near Essen, Germany, and the Ruhr Valley, again, is the industrialization aspect of Germany. RAF pilot Gordon Cockcroft and his captain Ray Smith were flying a Halifax bomber where they saw a cylindrical object. It was silvery gold, and he described it of having several portholes that were evenly spaced along the craft, but it hung motionless in the sky as they went by. And as they approached, then it sped away at what he estimated at thousands of miles per hour. So I would assume that a pilot in those days could determine or could mess up when it came to a couple hundred miles per hour. But the fact that he said it was in the 1,000 miles per hour shows that it was so significant, it was beyond the technological aspects of any aircraft that he was aware of. Mm-hmm. Of course, he reported it to the intelligence officer, and when he did, it made no impression on the intelligence officer that he reported it to. And that really confused him, but he dropped it, and the official report doesn't exist. And then in early 1944, this, Captain Leeds' sighting was in November. Early in 44, there were 2 sightings in February of over Germany. One was over Germany near Aachen, and they saw a silvery cigar-shaped object. And the key thing here is terminology, and this was an official report. Like an airship. So the key here is like an airship. Not it was an airship, but like an airship, and it appeared to be a line of windows along the bottom of the object was seen. And that was also in the same another report in February of 44 over France. There were sightings of 3 silver objects, and the key point here is resembling Zeppelins, moving independently of the wind, and they weren't connected, so there was some type of individual control associated. Now, these 2 reports were in United States Army Air Force Intelligence Memoranda as per RAF Flak Liaison Officer reports. And these were officers who went up with the missions to observe the crew, the combat situation, just to determine if the crew are reporting accurately, and just another set of eyes that was not straddled with the aspect of, having to mount a machine gun or fly or watch. He was just there for observation purposes. So that's very significant. Then another very important sighting has been August 12, 1944, over southern France. And Brian Frau and Ronald Claridge, they had a sighting of an enormous disk that probably is 5 times the size of their Lancaster aircraft, hanging motionless in the sky, portholes along the side, and it sat there and then in an instant shot out of sight with no sound or exhaust. They reported it, and the intelligence officers were not interested. So this is 44. So we're starting to think, well, did that unit start to say, look, don't let on that you're worried about this, act as if there's nothing wrong, get that intelligence report to us. So that's what I'm assuming may have been taking place.
Yeah.
Then we have, of course, starting 2 days after Captain leaked, we have the sighting of the first official report sighting of the Foo Fighters, which was by the 415th Night Fighter Squadron. And for the next 4 months, a variety of sightings of single and multiple lights, some that just appeared out of nowhere, some that seemed to come from the ground, some that came from above. And it was definitely enough to completely mystify the unit. It was enough to bring somebody from Washington into the unit to investigate it, which was, of course, kept secret. They actually went up on a flight to try to see it themselves, but I don't believe that took place where they did see it. And Major Augsburger, who sighted it himself, he saw it, I guess around December, he went up, and when he saw it, it was a light that came off the wingtip, and then after a while, it maneuvered with him. They couldn't maneuver around it. It was able to mimic their capabilities, and then it shot straight up into the stars to disappear. That startled him, and he started thinking, this sci-fi realm of it, because they just could not account for German technology, because they knew what the V1 was. They knew what the V2 was. ME-262s and ME-163s were on the scene, and within weeks, pilots were able to actually engage in combat with these because they knew the flight characteristics. They knew that the jet needed so much space to turn around, so they, being a single prop aircraft, they could just cut in on it and, actually engage it to some extent.
Yeah.
So those are pretty key. And then I guess one of the last signs I'd like to bring up is like March of 1945, and this would be the first time that a ground unit reported what I think were Foo Fighters.
Mm-hmm.
And this was between Mannheim and Darmstadt along the Autobahn. Infantryman John Norris was camped along a highway with his unit, and coming up parallel to the highway were 6 or 7 yellowish-orange circular objects. No sound. It was somewhat foggy. They were 3 to 4 feet in diameter. They acted independent of each other, traveling at about 10 miles per hour, and I'd say he said 150 feet or so in the air. Came along where they were bivouac, and then proceeded down along the highway silently. And it was very eerie, very different. So, one, we know it wasn't flares, the way that they performed. 2, they were traveling too slow to be aircraft of any known type. There was no noise, and of course, balloons don't operate in that type of manner.
Yeah.
Anything that would be applied that their intelligence people would say. Now, I have no idea what happened, but it wasn't just like he saw it. The whole unit bivouac there, so that report, too, is missing. So there's some great reports. Andy Roberts and Dr. David Clark in England are very instrumental in bringing about the Foo Fighter and the wartime reports in Britain by the Air Ministry, because they've done great work. And Andy Roberts was one of the first people, I believe, to do an in-depth investigation of the Foo Fighters that he ended up dropping. He just didn't pursue any longer. I believe Jan Aldrich and Barry Greenwood came up with some of the reports that they encountered in interviews, post-war. So you see these incredible sightings. You see some type of aircraft that today is being seen, cigar-shaped, cylindrical-shaped, portholes, able to hang motionless, able to travel at speeds beyond any known aircraft capability. So we can see how, indeed, the UFO of today appeared to be right with us in World War II.
And the next element to the story I wanted to get into was Bob Wilson, I believe Associated Press reporter, went over to Europe right around New Year's Eve. He wanted to fly into enemy territory or something like that as the clock struck midnight, and he had a big idea for a big AP story on that. And of course, it turned into something totally different, and it resulted in the explosion in the media of the Foo Fighters, and probably what we have to blame, I guess you could say, for the popularity of the name Foo Fighter and that sort of thing. I think that media explosion probably is why we call them Foo Fighters nowadays. I guess just share with us the Bob Wilson story and how that came about and the subsequent media explosion.
Okay, yeah, Bob wasn't true. He wanted the scoop. That particular New Year's Eve, he wanted to get up there and be the first to report during a bombing mission over Germany, because there was much anticipation that the war was going to end fairly soon. They felt that since the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive had been pretty much taken care of, Germany was now on the run big time. And so he wanted to be, of course, here we are. We are going to rescue Europe finally. And it was during that time a storm moved in, and it was too much fog or too much sleet or ice that they kept the night fighters on the ground. So he was with the 415th Night Fighter Squadron. Of course, he didn't know about the Foo Fighters. However, they played cards and they spoke well into the night, and they said, well, we'll give you a story. We'll tell you about the Foo Fighters. And he just sat there and listened about all these stories, because by then just about everybody had seen the Foo Fighters at least once. Some guys saw them 6 and 7 times.
Oh, wow.
And it became old hat. They laughed about it. It became a point where the guys weren't really scared of it. They were just like mystified by it. So he took that story and ran with it. And by the next couple of days, major press picked it up. New York Times was grabbing it, Tribune, Time, Newsweek started getting the story. So it really started to flurry. And of course, Foo Fighter was the key term.
Yeah.
And it was as if nothing ever else was seen. So that shows the censorship already with the military and press, because there was very little as what you would call aerial phenomena that was released to the press at all. And because of that, the scientists and the engineers and the people back home started saying, well, this is what we think it was. We think it was remote-controlled devices, radar and or engine interference type of devices used, to either scare or take the aircraft down. They could have been magnetic devices that attracted to the aircraft just to play a cat and mouse to take the attention off of the combat mission. A secret weapon, hallucinations, optical illusions. And it was just like you read today. Someone sees a report, next thing you know, you get, okay, you may have seen this, but then you start to see maybe some character assassination, or really disregarding what that person saw. What was really a problem was night fighter pilots were the cream of the crop, or were very few in number. I believe 81 to 82,000 pilots were trained during World War II, American Air Force pilots. Only around 400 were night fighter pilots.
Oh, wow.
These guys they were flying by the seat of their pants. They were flying by radar, which was constantly under development. They were in a combat situation, and they were flying several hundred feet above the ground at times. Their mission was to go in to attack railroad stations, railroad cars, truck convoys, anything that had a light on it. So their vision was pretty good, and they were able to distinguish a lot. And they had to really have their factors together in terms of not overreacting, not panicking. And so they were a pretty brave, somewhat crazy lot. And so there they were, and they were seeing these stories coming out of the press from guys back home, armchair researchers, armchair theorizers, and saying, oh, no, you didn't see that. You saw this, or it was that. And these guys were reporting things that they could see no physical craft behind. In some instances, they felt they saw sharp outlines of a craft, but they never saw wings. So that was confusing them. So they were sure that when they're looking out off their wingtip, and it's a foggy night, and there's something out there mimicking the flight pattern and the evasive maneuvers of their aircraft, and they're trying to engage it in combat, and they can't. It's more than them hallucinating.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, in some instances, they picked it up on radar, but in most cases, the radar operator could not find it, even though he was looking out the window right at it. And they were sure it was not meteorological or natural phenomena, just because they were there to analyze it. But for those back home, there's no way that it couldn't be as simple as that. So, in general, I think the military were determining that it was secret weaponry, and so the pilots were looking at it as that, even though they suspected otherwise, because it was too far of a leap for Germany at the time in that situation.
Yeah. Now, prior to the Bob Wilson story, was there really much national attention on the Foo Fighter story? Did anyone even had it even entered the public consciousness yet, or was that really the first time that it sort of people had heard about it back in America?
That was the first time that term was ever even heard of, and pretty much that kind of story. I believe some of the ordnance related, they call it the Christmas balls. They were glass balls, and the disc were reported and made headlines, very minor headlines, like in the New York Times, about strange Christmas-like devices seen over Germany. That could have been Foo Fighters. That was misidentified. The press didn't realize what was being seen, and they only had so much information. But the first time that the Foo Fighters and this phenomena took off in terms of that they were aircraft possibly was with the Bob Wilson story.
Yeah. Now, I got the impression that media explosion sort of only lasted a brief period of time, and then it sort of died out. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. A couple months, it petered out. It was a flurry for like 2 months. And even then, it took the back seat to everything else that was going on in the war.
Mm-hmm.
So, and when Time and Newsweek released their story, it was literally a paragraph or two.
Oh, wow.
It was nothing.
Yeah.
It was just, here's what our boys are seeing, and here's what the scientists are saying. And it just dropped. It just went out of the consciousness of the people.
Yeah. There you have it, folks. That does it for this week's edition of BOA Audio Season 3. Big thanks to Keith Chester for coming on the show and giving us so much time. Of course, he'll be back next week to finish up the conversation. I'll preview that in a little bit. If you want to find out more information on Keith Chester, unfortunately, he does not have a website, but you can pick up Strange Company Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II at Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, go to Anomalous Books, or go to your bookstore and order it. Go through any of those methods, and you'll be able to get your hands on a copy of this fantastic book. Definitely check it out. I highly recommend Strange Company. Before we dive into the BOA Audio listener feedback mailbag, I should throw out a plug here. I did an interview this past week on Jeremy Vaney's Culture of Contact podcast. Definitely check that out. Moving right along now, it's time for BOA Audio listener feedback. And this week's letter is one that I discussed on my Culture of Contact appearance, but I only read a little bit of it, and I want to dig right into the whole text of the email here. This letter comes from Terry, no hometown listed. Here's what she has to say. Hi, I have a friend who claims to have some alien animals. He says they're ferret-like and friendly, and of course, they're invisible. He claims that he got them last summer, and they have been with him ever since. Since last summer, they have had babies, and now they're suddenly dying. He asked me to help him, and asked that I contact MUFON about this, and he says he needs help in keeping them alive. I don't know if there's anything to be done, or even if they're real, but I will do as he asks on the off chance they're real, and I can't see animals in pain. Please, if there's anything you can do to help, let me know, and I will pass it along. Thanks so much in advance, Terry. So there you go. Terry, thank you for writing to me. As I noted on Culture of Contact, when I originally read the email and responded to it, I didn't see the word invisible for some reason. It was actually invisible, I guess, to my eyes. So I wrote Terry back saying, if you can get a picture of the animals, send it to me, and then maybe we can figure out what to do about it. She probably thinks I'm some sort of jerk, so Terry, I apologize. I skimmed right over the invisible part and didn't even notice that. So I'm not really sure what to say. I guess we'll extend the call to help for the BOA Audio listeners. If you've got some invisible alien animal care advice, definitely send it my way, and I will forward it along to Terry. This is an honest-to-goodness email that I got, folks. Definitely one of the strangest ones I've ever received. Thanks again for writing, Terry. It's much appreciated. I'm sure the animals will be in good shape one way or another. If you'd like to be a part of BOA Audio listener feedback, there's two ways to do it. Either you go to binnallofamerica.com, click the contact button on the left-hand side of the screen. That will bring you to the BOA contact page with all of the appropriate information. Or you can simply write to boaaudio@hotmail.com. Either one of those methods puts your correspondence in the BOA Audio listener feedback inbox. Up next is the thanks portion of the program. Super huge thanks to the fantastic BOA staff for your help and support with the audio series and the website. Leslie, Chiron, R. Lee, Joe V., and Tina Senna, week in, week out, providing top-notch reading material for BinnallofAmerica.com. This past week at the website, Tina Senna wrote about her run-in with the blue light phenomenon when she was a kid. It's a very creepy story. It's very cool. Definitely check that one out. In Gray Matters, Leslie discussed the stark difference in press coverage between the UFO press conference from a couple weeks ago and the Richard C. Hoagland press conference from earlier in the month of November, and tries to come to some sort of conclusion about why there was such a big difference between the press coverage of those two press conferences. Following that, Chiron of the K-Files fame wrote about his personal experience with sleep paralysis. A very entertaining piece from Chiron, definitely worth checking out for anyone who's experienced something strange happening to them in the middle of the night. Chiron looks at it with his own special chironic point of view. So there's tons of stuff going on at the website aside from the audio you're listening to right this very moment. As we say, week in and week out here on the program, if you're only listening to BOA Audio and you're not reading the columns at Binnallofamerica.com, you're only getting half the story. Binnallofamerica.com, make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. Now comes the time, of course, where we ask for donations. Folks, this program is free of charge. It definitely costs me a pretty penny to make the phone calls to acquire the bandwidth necessary for all of our great listeners to be able to download the program, and of course lots of time and effort go into putting together the programs. We need your donations to keep BOA Audio and Binnallofamerica.com in the black. We're hovering in the red right now. We'd like to get the program back in black, like the old AC/DC song says. How can we get it back in the black? That's simple. Through donations from great BOA Audio listeners like you. Here's how you do it. You go to Binnallofamerica.com, click the PayPal button. It's either on the front page of the website or in the audio archive page. That'll put you on the road to making a donation, which will go towards making sure that the website and the audio series is freely available for all of our great listeners the world over. So, go to BOA, click the PayPal button, make a donation. It would be greatly appreciated. Now, I know last week we teased that we'd have the new merchandise up at BOA on Black Friday. We ran into a couple snags. The gist of it is, while an image may look really cool on your computer screen, when you get it into the shop and you start looking at it on merchandise, you start to notice little things that need to be adjusted. That's pretty much where we're at right now. In all honesty, I could have rolled the merchandise out on Friday, but I don't want to roll out crap. So my artist is working double time right now to fix some of the little mistakes and some of the little quibbles that I had with some of the images. We expect to have the new BOA line and the store for the BOA line up and running at Binnallofamerica.com. Hopefully on Monday, possibly by the time you're listening to this, unless of course you're listening to it 5 minutes after I put it up. But if you're listening to this later on in the weekend, Sunday evening, or Monday, Tuesday, one of those days, hopefully we'll have the BOA store up and running and ready for you to check out the new merchandise and hopefully make some purchases. Alright, I've been yakking here, but we got one more part of the program to get to, of course, and that's the preview for next week. You already know the guest. It's Keith Chester, but this time it's part 2 of 2. And again, we'll be talking about Strange Company, military encounters with UFOs in World War II. Our conversation is going to continue as we discuss why the Foo Fighters probably weren't St. Elmo's fire, the relationship between Foo Fighters and radar, similarities and differences between Europe and Pacific aerial phenomena, post-war information gleaned about the Foo Fighters from Germany and Japan, and the potential for German UFO technology. We'll also delve into those big picture questions that we love here on the program, as we'll find out what Keith really thinks the Foo Fighters were as a whole, how the Foo Fighter phenomena fits into the theory that nuclear testing is what attracted the UFOs. What did the government really think the Foo Fighters were? Did they ever, and if so, at what point, consider that they were extraterrestrial craft? And the trials and tribulations of finding witness testimony to the Foo Fighter era. Additionally, at the end of the program, we're going to talk about Keith's mentor, Len Stringfield, and his role in shaping ufology. So we're going to get a little biography portion of the program at the end. As always, there's tons and tons more. I just scratched the surface there on that little preview. So come on back to BOA next week for more with Keith Chester talking about strange company, military encounters with UFOs in World War II. And on that note, we wrap it up for one more week. Thank you so much for listening, folks. Until next time, this is Tim Binnall signing off.